They were, of course, very anxious to see a person on whom so much of their comfort at Barton must depend. Lady Middleton was not more than 6 or 7 and 20. Her face was handsome, her figure tall and striking, but she was reserved, cold, and had nothing to say for herself beyond the most commonplace inquiry or remark. Conversation, however, was not wanted, for Sir John was very chatty, and would not leave the house without securing their promise of dining at the park the next day. Barton Park was about half a mile from the cottage. The house was large and handsome, and the Middletons lived in a style of equal hospitality and elegance. Sir John was a sportsman, Lady Middleton a mother. He hunted and shot, and she humoured her children, and these were their only resources. Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters were met at the door of the house by Sir John, who welcomed them to Barton Park with unaffected sincerity. They would see, he said, only one gentleman there besides himself, a particular friend who was staying at the park. He hoped they would all excuse the smallness of the party, and could assure them it should never happen so again. Luckily, Lady Middleton's mother had arrived at Barton within the last hour, and as she was a very cheerful, agreeable woman, he hoped the young ladies would not find it so very dull as they might imagine. Mrs. Jennings, Lady Middleton's mother, was a good-humoured, merry, fat, elderly woman who talked a great deal. Colonel Brandon, the friend of Sir John, was silent and grave. His appearance, however, was not unpleasing, in spite of his being in the opinion of Marianne and Margaret an absolute old bachelor, for he was on the wrong side of 35. In the evening, as Marianne was discovered to be musical, she was invited to play. Her performance was highly applauded. Colonel Brandon, alone of all the party, heard her without being in raptures. He paid her only the compliment of attention. The Dashwoods were now settled at Barton, with tolerable comfort to themselves. The whole country about them abounded in beautiful walks. The high downs invited them from almost every window of the cottage, and towards one of these hills did Marianne and Margaret one memorable morning direct their steps, attracted by the partial sunshine of a showery sky. Suddenly the clouds united over their heads, and a driving rain set full in their face. Chagrined, they were obliged to run with all possible speed down the steep side of the hill which led immediately to their garden gate. They set off. Marianne had at first the advantage, but a false step brought her suddenly to the ground, and Margaret, unable to stop herself to assist her, was involuntarily hurried along and reached the bottom in safety. A gentleman carrying a gun, with 2 pointers playing around him, was passing up the hill when the accident happened. He put down his gun and ran to her assistance. Perceiving that her modesty declined what her situation rendered necessary, took her up in his arms without farther delay, and bore her directly into the house whither Margaret was just arrived. Elinor and her mother rose up in amazement at their entrance. Mrs. Dashwood thanked him again and again, and begged to know to whom she was obliged. His name, he replied, was Willoughby, and his present home was at Allenham, from whence he hoped she would allow him the honour of calling tomorrow to inquire after Miss Dashwood. The honour was readily granted, and then he departed. His manly beauty and more than common gracefulness were instantly the theme of general admiration. Sir John called on them as soon as the next interval of fair weather that morning allowed him to get out of doors, and Marianne's accident being related to him, he was eagerly asked whether he knew any gentleman of the name of Willoughby at Allenham.
"Willoughby?" cried Sir John. "What? Is he in the country? That is good news."
"You know him, then?" said Mrs. Dashwood.
"Know him? To be sure I do. As good a kind of fellow as ever lived, I assure you."
"But who is he?" said Elinor. "Has he a house at Allenham?" On this point Sir John could give them more certain intelligence, and he told them that Mr. Willoughby had no property of his own in the country, that resided there only while he was visiting the old lady at Allenham Court, to whom he was related, and whose possessions he was to inherit. Marianne's preserver, as Margaret styled Willoughby, called at the cottage early the next morning to make his personal inquiries, and everything that passed during the visit tended to assure him of the sense, elegance, mutual affection, and domestic comfort of the family to whom accident had now introduced him. Of their personal charms he had not required a second interview to be convinced. Miss Dashwood had a delicate complexion, regular features, and a remarkably pretty figure. Marianne was still handsomer. Her form, though not so correct as her sister's in having the advantage of height, was more striking. It was only necessary to mention any favourite amusement to engage her to talk. They speedily discovered that their enjoyment of dancing and music was mutual, and that it arose from a general conformity of judgment in all that related to either.